You thought you'd turned out the lights.
But in the quiet darkness,
Some stories refuse to stay buried. Bedtime Stories. Uncover the truth. Subscribe if you dare.
The Painter at the End of the Alley. Tonight, if your eyes are tired and your thoughts are still a little too loud, I'd like to tell you a quiet, Gothic sleep story. A story about time and a face that refused to change. Somewhere in an old city, where the streets had slowly forgotten their own names, there was a narrow alley that most people walked past without seeing. At the very end of that alley stood a small painting studio. Its windows were always a little dusty. Its sign was so faded that you could only guess there had once been letters there. Inside, however, a single candle always seemed to be burning, no matter how late, no matter how cold the night became. People whispered about that place. They said that if you were afraid of time, if the thought of waking up one day and not recognizing your own reflection made your heart tighten in your chest, you could go there. One cold evening, when the fog had slipped low over the rooftops and the church bells in the distance rang out a slow, lonely hour, a man stopped in front of the studio door. He was not old. His skin was still smooth, his hair still full, his posture straight. But there was something in his eyes, a tension that never really left them, the kind of quiet panic that belongs not to the present, but to all the years that might still come. He stood there for a long time, facing the door, feeling the soft light of the candle flicker behind the glass. It felt like a question. At last he lifted his hand and knocked 3 times, softly, as if trying not to fully commit to the act. The door opened without a creak, as though it had been expecting him. Inside, the air was warmer, though the light was weak. Candles were scattered across shelves and tables, their flames small and golden, just enough to reveal frames on the walls and the faint, familiar smell of oil paint hanging in the room. In the middle of the studio, an old painter sat on a wooden chair. His back was a little bent, his hair long and white, but his eyes were remarkably clear, bright in the half-dark, like 2 pale embers. He looked at the visitor as if he had been waiting a long time. "You've arrived," the painter said quietly. "I thought you might come, a few years later." The man frowned. "You know who I am?" "I don't know your name," the painter answered. "I only know that those who find this place all fear the same thing." The man didn't reply. He took off his gloves, laid his hat on the chair beside him, and stood in the soft circle of candlelight, weighing the idea of leaving or staying. "I've heard," he said at last, choosing his words carefully, "that if someone has their portrait painted here, time will not touch their face again." The sentence sounded rehearsed, but his voice trembled slightly as it left him. The painter studied him in silence. The lines of his cheekbones, the bridge of his nose, the restless tension hiding behind his eyes. "People like to exaggerate," the old man replied slowly. "But they're not entirely wrong." The visitor stepped closer. "I want to commission a portrait," he said. "Just one. But I want it to hold on to something that I can't seem to hold myself." The painter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to a corner of the room where a large white cloth hung over a frame. He rested his fingers on it very gently, the way one touches someone who is asleep. "Do you know?" he asked quietly. that every time I paint a face, I must find a place for it in the world? These are not only images. They take something, and they leave something. The man heard the words, but he didn't want to understand them. I want only one thing, he insisted softly, a little too quickly. I don't want to grow old. Not here. He lifted a hand and touched his own cheek. I could lose everything else. My reputation, my wealth, this city, even the people who know me. But if one morning I look into a mirror and cannot recognize the face looking back at me, I don't know who I would be. Silence pressed gently into the room. The candles crackled faintly, like the ticking of a clock inside a wall. At last, the painter nodded. Very well, he said. I'll paint you. But you must understand, time does not disappear. It only goes somewhere else. The man didn't ask where. He did not want that answer. The painter set up an easel, mixed his colours, and asked the man to sit on a worn wooden chair in front of him. Don't move too much, he said. Just be as you are. I'll do the talking with time for you. What followed felt like a long, heavy pause in the world. The brush moved softly over the canvas. The smell of oil grew thicker in the air. From time to time, the painter looked up, studying his subject not only as a collection of angles and shadows, but as someone carrying unspoken thoughts deep behind his eyes. The man sat very still, or at least tried to. Every now and then, a sharp fear rose in him. The fear that if he moved too much, if he said something too honest, the canvas would remember it forever. Outside, the city kept living, changing, aging, the way all cities do. But in this room, time felt heavy and slow, as if it had thickened into wet paint on the canvas. When the painter finally lowered his brush, the candles had burned much shorter. It's done, he whispered. The man stood and slowly approached the easel. There he was, on the canvas, himself, but sharper, clearer, like the most perfect version of his own face. No trace of fatigue, no lines near the eyes. The expression was calm, almost proud, looking out from the frame with a strange, quiet confidence. This is me? He asked. It is the face you wish to keep, the painter replied. From now on, you will no longer see it change. Something in his tone made the air turn a little colder, but the man was too enchanted by the portrait to notice. He paid the painter generously. The old man didn't count the money, only folded it and placed it in an old drawer. One last thing, he said as the man prepared to leave with the portrait. You may hang it anywhere you like, but if one day you find that you are too different from the one in the painting, do not pretend not to see it. By then, it's better to decide early. Decide what? The painter only smiled and gave no answer. The man carried the portrait out into the cold night, back into the city that continued its slow, unseen decay. He did not realize that from the moment he stepped over the threshold with that painting in his hands, time had chosen a different path, silent, patient, and impossible to undo.
Years passed. The city changed in its quiet, familiar way. Shops closed their doors, new names appeared above freshly painted windows. Old cafes lost their regulars and gained strangers. Faces on the street grew softer, slower, then were replaced by new ones. But he did not change. Every morning, he looked into the mirror and saw the face from the painting. Smooth skin, steady eyes, a mouth untouched by the weight of time. People noticed, of course. They said he aged well, that he had a secret, that some people were simply blessed. They joked that he must have made a bargain with something. He only smiled and turned the conversation away. In his large house, the portrait hung in a room of its own, a room almost no one entered. At first, he visited often. Standing before it, he felt reassured, as if he had won a private war against the one enemy nobody else could defeat. But one evening, when he stood in front of it again, he noticed something different, very small. A faint shadow beneath the eyes, a thin line at the corner of the mouth, the suggestion of a night spent awake with too many thoughts. He stepped closer, narrowing his eyes. It must be the light, he told himself. The lamp was at a different angle tonight. Or perhaps he was tired, imagining details that weren't really there. He left the room, turned off the light, and carefully closed the door. In the weeks that followed, he grew busier. Living as someone who does not age in a world that never stops aging is, in its own way, exhausting. The people in his old photographs changed. Gray appeared in their hair. Lines deepened around their eyes. Their hands looked slightly more uncertain each time they raised a glass. Some of them stopped attending parties. Some stopped leaving their houses. Some stopped appearing in any story at all. But he stood still, like a comma in a sentence that refused to move forward or end. One night, without quite knowing why, he thought again of the quiet room and the painting within it. He walked down the long corridor past the soft pools of yellow light on the floor. Standing before the door, he hesitated, just as he had before the studio door years ago. He opened it, switched on the lamp, and faced the portrait. This time, there was no way to blame the light. The face in the frame was still his, but it carried a weight that his own reflection did not. The shadows under the eyes were darker, two deep bruises of sleeplessness and thought. Fine lines had settled on the forehead, around the mouth. Not many, but enough to suggest years of worry, years of choices made and regretted. Worst of all was the look in the eyes. It was no longer calm. It looked straight out of the frame, through the empty room, through the man standing there, with a kind of tired understanding he did not want to see. He took a step back, his heart stuttering in his chest. "No," he whispered. "I still look the same." He fled to the mirror. The mirror agreed. He was as he had always been, young, untouched, a face that did not belong to someone who had lived so many seasons. Mirror and painting, one holding the present, one holding something else entirely. He did not sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the painted gaze, heavy, patient, like a ledger filling up quietly while no one watched. In the years that followed, he avoided the room as much as possible. His life grew even louder. More parties, more journeys, more conversations that meant little and filled his days completely. He moved faster, surrounded himself with noise and light, anything to drown out the steady ticking of a clock he could no longer see. Only the corridor to that room remained empty. Whenever he happened to walk past its door, his steps quickened, his eyes fixed straight ahead, afraid that if he so much as glanced at the wood, the portrait inside would somehow know he was still there. Then, on a night of heavy rain, when thunder rolled above the rooftops and the lights in his house flickered and went out, he found himself alone in the dark, without music, without voices, without escape. In that thick, humming silence, he heard a sound, very soft, a small creak, like wood shifting on a wall, like a frame adjusting itself ever so slightly. The sound came from the end of the corridor, from the room he had been avoiding for so many years. He stood very still. It could be the wind, he told himself. It could be the old house breathing in the storm. He knew that. He wanted to believe that. But his feet, ignoring every argument, began to move. The corridor was dark, lit now and then by pale flashes of lightning leaking around the curtains. His shadow stretched long and strange along the walls. A younger face carried on older movements. He reached the door. His hand found the cold metal of the handle. For a moment, he remembered the painter's words. If one day you find you are too different from the one in the painting, do not pretend not to see it. He turned the handle. The room was black. A flash of lightning briefly outlined the shape of the frame on the wall. He felt for the switch. A weak yellow light flickered on, pushing the darkness back just enough to reveal the familiar furniture, the covered chair, the solitary frame. He turned and faced the portrait. There was no distance left now. This was his face, if he had lived all his years honestly on his skin. Eyes sunken, but awake. Lines marking every fear, every late-night decision, every quiet act of selfishness he had chosen not to think about. The painted gaze was not cruel, but it held everything. Every year he had refused to carry. "Is it true," he whispered, "that you have lived all those years for me?" No answer came, but the silence felt very much like a yes. He sank into the chair opposite the painting, for the first time in a very long time, allowing himself not to run. Outside, the rain tapped steadily on the windows. Inside, two identical faces stared at each other across a small, quiet room, one impossibly preserved, one impossibly burdened. "If I destroy you," he said at last, his voice barely audible, "will all of this return to me?" He touched his own cheek again. The skin was still smooth, still wrong. He didn't know if he expected an answer from the painting, the room, or that hidden part of himself he had been avoiding for so long. He stood slowly, approached the frame, and laid his hand on its edge. He could, with one motion, tear it down, shatter it, burn it, and let time flood back into the place it should have been all along. But his hand trembled, not from fear of aging, but from the sudden realization that he had let that fear make every choice for him for far too many years. He let go. He did not destroy the painting. Instead, he pulled the chair closer, sat down beneath it, and looked up. "If you have lived all those years in my place," he murmured, "then tonight, at least, I will stay here with you." Nothing miraculous happened. The painted face did not grow younger. His living face did not suddenly wrinkle. There were only two pairs of eyes, equally dark, equally his. One heavy with everything experienced, one empty from everything avoided, finally agreeing to meet in the middle. Outside, the storm grew quiet. Night softened toward morning. At some point, his head rested back against the wall. His eyes drifted closed. For the first time in a very long time, he slept without running from anything, without bargaining with time, without asking for more or less. Time, having taken the longest, strangest route it could find, simply went on. And if tonight, on your own wall, there is a painting or a photograph watching you as you fall asleep, you can hope it is only paper and color. And if it is more than that, perhaps it is only waiting for you to sit down, be still for a while, and finally let time catch up gently.